Hello there, welcome to this British Empire revision lesson. This is mainly focusing on, well, pretty much only focusing on Year 12 content today. So you've got to remember with the British Empire AQA course, these are the big questions in the specification. So these are the things that these are the big questions we're thinking about when we look at this course. So the first one is, why did the British Empire grow and contract? So why does empire grow? It's mainly going to be Year 12, and then in Year 13, you will look at the contraction when empire starts to crumble. The second big question is, what's influencing imperial policy? So that could be, for example, for trade and commerce. That could be because of European competition. That could be because of the role of individuals. There are a range of things that are influencing the British when they make decisions to do with empire. Leading on from that is the third big question, which is what part did economic factors play in the development of the British Empire? So we're looking at trade and commerce mainly here, but we're also looking at a number of ways that the British and other individuals were able to make money from the British Empire. The other thing you're looking at is, how did empire influence British attitudes and culture? And that, for example, is be looking not just at what's happening in empire itself, but also looking in Britain as well to see how actually the British public viewed empire. Was it popular? Did they even know what was going on? So that's questions linked to that. Next one is, how do the indigenous peoples respond to British rule? So here, when we look at the indigenous peoples, we mean the people of empire. So for example, in India, when it refers to the indigenous people, those are the Indian people living in India, not the British people. And finally, we look at the role of key individuals and groups and how they're affected by the developments. So as we know, empire was a huge, vast thing. The British government back in London did not always completely control what was going on. Individuals, Cecil Rhodes would be a good example, chartered company directors. These people also had quite a lot of influence, and we got groups, for example, explorers, missionaries, also to look at. Okay, so this is a very, very brief history of the British Empire. I'm obviously going to focus on the 1857 onwards, but I'll give you a bit of the context before 1857 as well. So the Americas doesn't play a huge part in this course, but obviously the key thing you need to know about this is Britain originally had its 13 colonies. Britain loses them in the American War of Independence, the American Revolution, but Canada remained a British colony. And the British didn't want to repeat the mistake they'd made in America. So what they did in the 1860s is they decided that they would give the settlers in Canada a certain amount of, I suppose what you'd say is a certain amount of control of their own destiny. So what the British are doing is they're allowing Canada to become a dominion in 1867, which means that the settlers there will be able to have a certain amount of control over their own affairs, and the British will not actually on a day-to-day, will not be involved in the day-to-day running of Canada, but they will, for example, still be involved in foreign affairs, and they will still be expected to defend Canada. That's obviously good for the British because they are ensuring that the Canadian settlers are remaining loyal, but also this is an example of the British thinking about costs as well, and actually by giving the Canadians their own freedom and responsibility, they're also taking away some of the costs associated with that. But it's also worth remembering that the British still had to do all of the defence. Okay, now in Europe, Britain doesn't have a huge empire, but one of the key strategic points that Britain has to consider is the Mediterranean. So Britain had always, from 1714, had Gibraltar and Minorca, and these were obviously in the sea near Spain and North Africa, and these were really important strategically because it's the entrance to the Mediterranean. In 1814, Britain gets the island of Malta. Then one of the key acquisitions in this period is Britain gains Cyprus from the Ottomans in 1878. Now, if you look to see where Cyprus is, it's just north of the Suez Canal, and obviously the Suez Canal was completed in 1869, so Cyprus is going to be strategically important for the trade route from Britain to India via the Suez Canal. Okay. So North Africa. The British had some involvement in North Africa before 1869, but it's important to note that this is very, very small. The big change occurs in 1869 when the Suez Canal, the construction of this is finished. Now, originally the Suez Canal was a French venture, so the top engineer who designs it is Guy de Lesseps, and he was French, and a lot of this infrastructure was a French venture. The British actually don't really want the canal to be built at the beginning because they felt like it could be a distraction, and they felt like it could open a can of worms, so to speak. The British before this had simply sailed to India via the Cape of Good Hope, so modern day South Africa. However, the Suez Canal will obviously be a huge strategic asset because it will shorten the route from Britain to India by 6,000 miles. So when the Suez Canal gets completed in 1869, the British obviously become a lot more interested in it. Before that, there was an overland route, but obviously it was a lot strategically a lot more difficult to have to take the goods from the sea back overland, etc. Suez Canal is a big game changer for the British in North Africa. In 1875, the British Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Disraeli, he acquires shares in the Suez Canal, and this is starting to increase Britain's involvement. So Egypt at this time was nominally under the control of the Ottoman Empire, but there was a local Egyptian ruler who was the main person in charge. The Egyptian rulers in this period are actually in a lot of debt. So when they've built the Suez Canal, they've done it, but they've had to borrow a lot of money. So this is when in 1876, the British and the French step in. They are invited by the local Egyptians. They step in to stabilize the finances of Egypt. So to the south of Egypt is Sudan. Now, Sudan is obviously really important because of the Nile. If you control Sudan, you have the potential to, especially later on in the period, to dam the Nile, and this would obviously be very damaging to the fertile region either side of the Nile in Egypt. So Sudan is always going to be a strategic place that Egypt and whoever controls Egypt have to be aware of. And historically, Sudan had always been part of an Egyptian empire. So in 1881, there's a big uprising in the Sudan. And in 1882, there is an uprising also in Egypt against British intervention there. So, for example, in Alexandria, there are 50 Europeans killed. And the British and the French can't just stand there and let this happen because of all of the instability that this creates. And they want the Suez Canal to be a nice and stable zone. And they want to be able to influence the Egyptian rulers so that they have good access to the Suez Canal. So the British are worried that they feel like the Suez Canal zone in Egypt is not secure. So what they do is they launch an invasion, and I think it's within about 3 days they're able to defeat the local Egyptian ruler. And what they do is they turn it into a veiled protectorate, which means that the British are pretty much pulling all of the strings. The British now control what's going on in Egypt. However, they do decide to keep the local ruler in place, and that local ruler will act like a puppet ruler who is being controlled by the British. Now, at this time, there was some British military involvement in Sudan, in Khartoum. And what happened was the British forces there, and now this is under Gladstone, and Gladstone actually is one of the British prime ministers who does not want to expand empire for the sake of it. He believes that empire should be a trading empire and that Britain should not be acquiring lots and lots of colonies because this would be a waste of money. However, he is the leader who has started Britain's veiled protectorate in Egypt. However, when there is this military problem in Sudan, Gladstone asked for the British to withdraw. However, there was a British military official called Gordon, whose nickname was Chinese Gordon because he had been involved in British military battles in China. He refused to leave his garrison in Khartoum, and eventually the British do send a relief force to Gordon to help him and his fellow soldiers. However, they get there, I think, a day or two too late. By the time they get there, General Gordon and his followers have been killed, And Gordon becomes a bit of a Christian hero. There's this famous image of him standing at the top of some stairs, and you've got some soldiers from Sudan who are presented, I think, with spears, and they are looking like they're about to attack him. There's a clear, Gordon is being presented as some sort of Christian martyr, Christian hero. So Gordon is killed, but he becomes a bit of a hero in Britain, and there is a call to avenge this death. And people in Britain are calling for the British Army to go into Sudan and to get revenge. However, Gladstone does not want to do this. He does not think it's a good use of resources and time for the British to go into Sudan, because at that stage they didn't really think it was worth it. However, we can fast forward now 13 years, and there is a different British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, at this point. And at this stage, the British do go and regain control. Well, they gain control of Sudan. And the Battle of Omdurman is the key battle where the British gain control of Sudan. Now, in this time, North Africa, the big European rivalry between that Britain faced was from France. There was a big rivalry there. And in 1898 is the Fashoda incident. So the British had an army in the area, and obviously we know the French had control in Morocco, Algeria. And there's a French army in the area and a British army in the area. And the two armies are marching towards Sudan. And as the two armies are marching towards one another, there's a bit of a media frenzy in the UK, and people are starting to, they're saying that there's a potential for a war to break out between these two armies. In the end, the two armies meet near Fashoda, and the French agree to back down. They turn back, and this is a key sign that Sudan will be under British control for the foreseeable future. So what happens is Sudan becomes a condominium, and it is going to be under Anglo-Egyptian protection. So we know that from 1882, Britain ruled Egypt as a veiled protectorate. However, in 1914, in the chaos of the war, the British need to completely shore up and firm up this control. So they make Egypt into an official protectorate. So in East Africa, the British did have some small expeditions at the beginning of this period, but it does all change in the 1850s. We get two British explorers, Burton and Speke. They start discovering more land, territory, resources in this period. And one of the key things that they're trying to look for is the source of the River Nile. The Germans have a role here in East Africa, and you can see in 1886 there's an agreement between the British and the Germans over how they're going to divide land up in East Africa. Now, the British weren't entirely sure of what resources were in East Africa, but they didn't want European rivals, especially Germany, to take good land in case resources were later discovered. But the British don't necessarily want to have to take formal control over these areas, because it would usually be quite costly. So what the British do in this period is they reinvent chartered companies. Now, remember, chartered companies had gone out of fashion after the Indian Rebellion of 1857 to 1858, and we know that the East India Company had been dissolved. However, the British realized in this period that in the context of the scramble for Africa, when there are several European countries who want to take land in Africa, the British would bring back these chartered companies. Because remember, in the scramble for Africa, in order to gain influence over an area within these, so for example, at the Berlin Conference or the Brussels Conference, you needed to show that you had effective occupation over an area. And a chartered company is a perfect way of doing that, because the British could turn to the other European countries and say, no, we have a chartered company operating in this area. You cannot take it for your country. So the British government start allowing these chartered companies to operate. And these chartered companies, individuals, so you've got people like Sir William Mackinnon, they will play a key role in expanding British control here. So as you can see, from 1889 onwards, Britain does expand its control into East Africa. South Africa is one of the more interesting case studies, and obviously it links very much to the Boer War that breaks out in 1899 to 1902. So the 1500s, there isn't British interest in the Cape area, because it's a key place on the strategic route from Britain to Asia, especially India, China. Now, the British needed a place to stop off as they sailed around the Cape of South Africa, and this area was really important. So this is a stop-off place for the British at first, a place where they can drop off supplies, have a bit of a rest on their way to India. And it's actually the Dutch who are the first people to settle, or the first European group to settle this area. So at first you get Dutch settlers, who we know as Boers or later Afrikaners. And these group they're very strict Protestant Calvinists. They're very religious, and they were known for being farmers. They wanted to settle the land, and one of the things that they did was they would use African labor, and in many cases they're using enslaved people for labor. Now, the British actually acquire the Cape from the Dutch in 1806, and that's part of the Napoleonic Wars that are going on at that time. In 1842, the British expand to get Natal, and you can see that's slightly more east of the Cape. And this is the reason for this is its strategy. They are just protecting that part of the country, and it's obviously on the trade route to India. So by 1860, we've got two British colonies, Cape Colony and Natal. Now, we talked about those Dutch settlers before. When the British got involved, they had moved north. Many of them did not. Well, one of the things we know, the British abolished the slave trade in 1807, and slavery is fully abolished in 1833 in the British Empire. Now, these Dutch settlers did not like that. And so what they do is from the 1830s, they do something called the Great Trek, which is a big trek. They do it over a number of weeks, a number of years to complete it. They go and find land further north. And this is obviously going to draw them into conflict with African indigenous groups in the area. So what the Boers do is they create two states in the northern part of what we call South Africa today. So they've got the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. Now look, and they call this the Great Trek, and these people become known as the Voortrekkers. So look, there is a bit of resentment from the Boers Afrikaners. But actually, you would say that for a long, long time after this period, the British and the Dutch settlers were able to coexist relatively peacefully. This completely changes in 1867 because diamonds are discovered in southern Africa. And the zone where they're discovered is near the Afrikaner Boer zones near Transvaal and Orange Free State. So suddenly, British policy changes, and the British now want to have access to these very, very, very profitable natural resources. So in this period, you start to get the British expanding further north. So the first bit they take is Basuto land, which is modern day Lesotho. They also take West Griqualand in 1871. And in 1872, a bit like they've done with Canada, is they allow Cape Colony to have responsible government. You'll notice here that the British are very prepared to give white settlers responsible government, but due to their racial thinking, they are not prepared to give this responsible government to non-white peoples of empire. So we mentioned that the Boers had moved northwards, and one of the groups that the Boers came into conflict was the Zulu people. In 1877, the Zulus attacked the Boers, and at this stage the Boers were relatively weak, and actually there was a chance that the Zulus could have successfully invaded and taken control of Boer Afrikaner territory. So the British in 1877, they decide that they will step in to protect their fellow white settlers. So what the British do in order to protect the Transvaal in 1877 is they annex the Transvaal and they help to keep the Zulus out. Now, the British make this seem as if they are doing this to protect the Boers. However, there is also potentially an ulterior motive that this is where diamonds have been discovered. So in this period, the British also gained control of Zululand. Now, as soon as the Zulu threat had diminished, the Boers then said, well, actually, we want to have our land back. Thank you very much for helping us in 1877, but we don't need your help anymore, and we would like our independence back. The British didn't allow this, and then the British face a bit of a humiliating defeat in the First Boer War in 1880 to 1881. The British are defeated in Majuba Hill, and what they do is they say, okay, we will give you back self-government. However, the British do maintain umbrella control over the Transvaal, especially over stuff like foreign policy. So in 1884, the next thing that happens is the Germans are starting to get involved in the region. So German Southwest Africa, which is modern day Namibia, the Germans take that in 1884, and the British were really worried because there was this friendship, historical friendship between the Germans and the Dutch. And so the British are worried that if you look at the map here, if the what's that green, dark green bit of German Southwest Africa linked up with Transvaal, there could potentially be quite a big counterweight to British control in southern Africa. So the British take an area of land which is modern day Botswana. They don't really want it for natural resources, but they do it to create a buffer zone between Transvaal and German Southwest Africa, so they can't join up and create a continuous line, horizontal line going east to west in southern Africa. And that's Bechuanaland, and I often call that the Bechuanaland buffer zone, but that's not an official name for it. So that's why the British take Bechuanaland. Now the situation gets even more critical in 1886 because gold is discovered, and this time again it's found closer to Boer territory than to British territory. So at this point, the British government, a bit like in East Africa, they want the British to have more influence in the area, so they start allowing chartered companies with British charters to go and operate in the area. So the most famous one is the British South Africa Company, and obviously that's going to be led by Cecil Rhodes. So Cecil Rhodes starts operating in the areas north of the Transvaal in modern day Zimbabwe and Zambia, and he calls these places, well, he names them after himself. So we've got Rhodesia, and then later on it's northern and southern Rhodesia. So the British want control over the Boer territories, and what the British want in this period is the British want to unite all of their territory. Well, they want to unite all of the territories in southern Africa. So we're talking Transvaal, Orange Free State, Natal, Cape Colony. They want them all to be in one confederation, one joined up confederation. And needless to say, they want the British to control it. Now, clearly, we've got a couple of groups who will be against that. We've got the Boers, first of all, who have just defeated the British in 1881, but we've also got African groups who will also try to resist this. So as the gold and diamonds have been discovered in South Africa, in the Boer territories, there needs to be proper capitalization. There needs to be proper capital that goes into these regions in order to mine the gold and diamonds effectively. There are some places where you can just literally just dig a little bit and get gold. It wasn't the case here in southern Africa. You needed to dig quite deep in order to mine it properly. Now, we've said that the Boers who control this territory, they were not renowned for their mining. They were farmers. That was something that they were used to. However, the British, and there were other foreigners who actually had this experience of mining. So you think about all of the tin mines in Cornwall. Britain had the expertise and it had the machinery to do this. So what starts happening is the Boers are actually allowing foreigners to come into their area, into their territory, to help them mine the gold and the diamonds. So they are welcoming these people. However, the Boers were not prepared to give complete voting rights and citizenship rights to these people. And they call these settlers, these foreign settlers, the Uitlanders, which is just Dutch for foreigners. So this is an interesting situation. We've got the British want this Boer territory because of the natural resources they've got access to, and they've got these British settlers who are working in these areas. Now, the British think, well, that these Uitlanders should have proper voting rights. And there is a question about, the question is, is it fair for the Boers to give these people, to not give these people proper citizenship? Now, in 1895, the British, I say the British, there are some British individuals, including Jameson and Cecil Rhodes. They tried to launch an invasion of Transvaal. So what they're going to do is, from Rhodesia, they're going to send in troops, and this is not officially a British government plan. They're going to, on horseback, they're going to ride into Boer territory, and they're hoping that all of the British people, settlers who are there, the Uitlanders, are going to help them against the Boers, Afrikaners. The whole plan flops. They do ride in, they're tracked for a while by the Boer soldiers. Eventually, the Boers successfully arrest all of the people who have invaded, and it's a real humiliation. Now, there's no real official evidence that the British government are involved, and the British actually very clearly after this state that this was nothing to do with them. However, it is seen to be a humiliation for the British, and Cecil Rhodes after this is forced to resign. He was actually not just a businessman, he was also the Prime Minister of Cape Colony. So this is seen to be a humiliation. Now, Germany, it does something which is seen to be quite controversial and seen to be quite provocative. The German Kaiser at the time, he actually sent a telegram to Paul Kruger, who was the leader, the Boer leader, and congratulates them for being able to repel the British. So this is seen to be quite provocative, and people in Britain don't like this. Now, we've got some individuals that play a very important role here. We've obviously talked about Cecil Rhodes, who had a very romantic vision of empire. Not only did he believe it was there for money to be made, he believed that empire was very important as a way of spreading British culture and British superior civilization. And obviously this is tied up with the civilizing mission and racial ideas about certain races being superior or inferior to others. We've also got Alfred Milner, who's the South African High Commissioner at the time. So he's working for the British government, and his role is to be in charge of South Africa for the British government. We've got someone called Chamberlain as well, who is the colonial secretary. So not just working in South Africa, he is looking after all British colonies, and that's his job in the British government. Now, all three of these people believe that the British should be dominant in the region. So they are all pushing for the British to take over Boer territory. Now, clearly, the Boers do not want this to happen. So if the Boers don't back down, then there will have to be a war. And eventually, the war does break out in 1899. The war doesn't start super well for the British, but eventually they win the war in a conventional sense. So what I mean by conventional is that the British are able to defeat the Boers in normal, almost like cavalry style warfare. However, the Boers then, what they do is they start using guerrilla warfare techniques, and eventually the British are able to regain control of the area. However, they rely on actually uprooting Boer people using concentration camps, where they take Boer people out of their villages and where they were living and put them into special camps surrounded by barbed wire, so they could keep an eye on them and so could control what was happening. However, the conditions at first in the concentration camps are so awful. Disease spreads. There are pictures of emaciated children. And it's a really bad look for the British, especially as we've got British people going out there reporting on this, including Emily Hobhouse, who starts spreading this around Britain, and people become aware of it and criticise the British. Now, eventually the British do improve the concentration camps, but this is seen to be a really humiliating time for the British. The British do eventually win the Boer War. So by 1902, the British technically win. However, the Afrikaner Boer people are still going to be very influential. The British want to try and balance up the settlers. They want there to be more British settlers. So they encourage loads of British settlement from people leaving British Isles to go to South Africa. But British people don't really take this up. So we've still got a very influential group of Afrikaners. So the British do get their, technically they get their confederation. The Union of South Africa is created. However, the Boer people are going to be the key people in this government, and the British do not get full control. Okay, and we can see that In 1910, we get the creation of Union of South Africa, which is a self-governing dominion. We've got British settlers, but also we've got these Dutch Boer Afrikaner settlers. So in West Africa, so the British for a long, long time had influence in West Africa because of their links and their key part in the trade of enslaved people. However, as the British abolished slavery in 1833, the old purpose of these West African colonies becomes less clear, the purpose of them. Now here, like in East Africa, and in South Africa, the British are using chartered companies to help claim their stake. So obviously the big key other European power in this part of Africa is France. And what the British do in this period is they use these chartered companies to help gain access to resources. And one of the key resources they want is palm oil. There's one example of a local ruler who does not want to cooperate with the British, because the British also would like to almost have indirect control. So they don't actually always want to fully control the colony. They would like to use local rulers, and with those local rulers, they simply wanted to have lots of influence over them, a bit like we saw in Egypt from 1882. However, when that wasn't the case and the local rulers did not want to help the British or collaborate or work with the British would simply go to war against them. So Ashantiland, the Ashanti king, is famous in this period for fighting against the British, and therefore the British would go to war and take control. In India, you don't need to know this part of the course, obviously, until the mutiny or the Indian Rebellion of 1857, but British control in Egypt, or influence in India, starts off with the East India Company, which gets a royal charter in 1600. The East India Company was a trading company. However, over time, it did gain much more control in India by using local Indian soldiers called sepoys to help them gain control. From the 1700s, the Mughal Empire, which had dominated India from about 1525, 1526, the Mughal Empire starts to crumble. They've taken way too much land. They've expanded too far south. They've got the Hindu Maratha kingdoms attacking them. They're facing attacks in Afghanistan, and they've also got the East India Company, who are using sepoys to help gain influence. It's in this chaos that the East India Company are able to dominate Britain or India. And so you'd say by about 1815 that the British, especially in this northern part of India, the East India Company are dominant here. Now, the British East India Company, they realized that they could not fully control the area. And what they do is they allow local rulers, and this is using a system that the Mughals had used. They allow local rulers to maintain some control. So the British are working and collaborating with local Indian rulers, and this is deemed to be a way of keeping control. One of the key things the British are able to do is they're able to tax, the East India Company are able to tax Indians, and this is a key way that they make money. And they're also able to use the Indian army, not just in India, but to go and fight other wars in other parts of the world, for example, in China. Now, the East India Company, East India Company officials had originally, in the early days, 1600s, 1700s, they had actually adopted Indian culture and customs. So, for example, there are sources which show East India Company officials wearing turbans, smoking hookah, or having Indian wives, and there was lots of intermarriage. However, by the time we get to the 1800s, those attitudes have changed quite a lot, and though that is definitely being frowned upon, this idea of this racial separation is starting to set in. So we get the British who tried to ban Thuggee and Sooty, an example of the British trying to impose their own culture on Indians. The British East India Company also allow Christian missionaries to operate in the area. So the Indian Rebellion starts in 1857 in Meerut, and one of the big, it's a sepoy, it starts off as a sepoy rebellion, but obviously it spreads to other people in the country. So people were upset for religious reasons, people were upset for tax reasons. There are a range of reasons why people were wanting to rebel against the East India Company. So we get this rebellion in the northern part of India, and it takes the British government over a year to regain control. It must be noted that there are lots of places that remain loyal to the British East India Company. However, by the time we get to 1858, the British government make this decision that they will dissolve the East India Company. And it's important to note that also by the time we get to 1857, from about 1800 onwards, the British government had taken some control from the East India Company. But from 1858, they fully end the East India Company's rule in India, and the British government will take control over India. So we get that this is the start of a period called the British Raj, which will obviously exist until 1947. So the British are interested in India with trading. It's very important that they maintain the Indian army, which is based, a lot of its strength comes from Indian sepoys. The British are worried that the Russian Empire, which is in Central Asia at this time, could go into Afghanistan and then threaten British India in the northwest. So the British go to war in Afghanistan in 1878, and eventually they put a pro-British ruler there, Mir there, to ensure that the Russians don't encroach on this. But this is a constant worry for the British. Like the East India Company, the British government wanted to train up a group of middle-class Indians who would almost be their intermediaries, people who would help the British rule, and they would be working in the Indian civil service. So the British are training up, giving British-style education, teaching English and British values to millions of middle-class Indians. Now, eventually, these middle-class Indians wanted a bit more representation. They wanted a bit more say in the affairs and the running of India. So in order to appease these people, the British government allow the creation of the Indian National Congress in 1885. This is originally a place for Indian nationalists, or let's call them not so much Indian nationalists, Indian middle classes who want more control, to discuss matters, and eventually this Indian National Congress will become the Indian Congress, which becomes the basis of the new government that's formed in 1947. Okay, so other parts of Asia. The British had a Persian factory near Iran in 1622, and they're involved in Southeast Asia in this period. The key big thing is China. China did not really want to trade with the British or Europeans at all. China did not almost look down upon Europeans, and they did not believe in global trade. They felt like all of the stuff they needed, they could get in China itself. However, the British in this period want to have access to Chinese tea. Remember, tea did not grow in India at this stage. The Chinese grew most of the tea. The British from India had lots of opium to sell. So what the British do is they want to exchange their opium for tea. The Chinese authorities don't want this, so the British force the Chinese to accept this, and this happens in the Opium Wars. And you can see we've got a couple of examples of this. It's because of this that the British are able to gain areas on the coast in China. So the British, for example, will get Hong Kong, and they will have that until 1997. The British also take territories in Southeast Asia, and in that area, so especially in Malaya, they're going to use rubber. They're going to plant rubber trees, and this is going to be a key natural resource for the British. One of the other places that the Russians are involved in taking is areas near the Persian Gulf, or modern-day Iran on that Persian Gulf. The British eventually, by 1907, they make an agreement with Russia that the area around Persia will be a neutral zone, and no European country will dominate there. And obviously, this is a key agreement that is going to create this alliance between Britain, France, and Russia, which is obviously the alliance that stands strong in the First World War. Australia. Australia was originally different group of colonies. So there was no sense of a united Australia at this time. The British took colonies along the coast, so Tasmania, Western Australia, South Australia, for example. The British had sent a lot of convicts to Australia as part of their transportation punishment. And you can see that the British in the 1850s start giving self-government to some of these Australian colonies and New Zealand colonies. And the main reasoning behind that is that they were white settlers and they were deemed to be wise and strong enough and intelligent enough to have their own independent government. Like in Canada, they will still have defence provided by the British. So it's the British have still got this influence over these areas. Eventually, what will happen is all of these colonies will join together to form an Australian Dominion in 1901, and equally there will be a 1907 New Zealand Dominion. Okay, so that has been a quick run through of some key things about this. There will be other videos that will help you with this. I hope you found that a nice little introduction or summary of quite a lot of different areas over quite a long period of time. I hope you found it useful. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.